This story is an emotional one that all parents should watch. After seeing this story, you will always check on your daughters and sons in boarding schools and even day schools. This story will help you understand the importance of checking on your children and asking them questions to know if they are facing any problems at school. At 16, Zainab's trusted teacher turned her school days into a nightmare, trapping her in silence with threats that scared her deeply. But when her best friend stumbled upon the truth, it set off a series of events that would expose a predator, shake the whole community, and test Zainab's strength like never before. Will she find justice and reclaim her life? Watch her powerful journey unfold. Before we begin this gripping tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, like, share this video, and comment on where you are watching from. Zainab, her mother's voice called from the kitchen. Hurry up, you'll be late for school. Yes, Mama, Zainab replied, quickly tying her school tie around her neck. She grabbed her bag and dashed out of the house, her well-polished black shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. The Abuja sun was already climbing high, bathing the neighborhood in a warm glow. At 15, Zainab was known for being disciplined and focused. She loved school and dreamed of becoming a doctor. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Musa, were proud of her. They worked tirelessly to ensure she had every opportunity to succeed, even though money was tight. As she walked briskly through the school gates, her eyes caught sight of her mathematics teacher, Mr. Ahmed, standing by the staff room door. He was a tall, confident man in his late 30s with a reputation for being strict but effective. His students admired him for making mathematics, often dreaded by many, a bit easier to understand. Yet, there was something about his gaze that always made Zainab uneasy. "Good morning, Mr. Ahmed," she greeted politely as she passed him. "Good morning, Zainab," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "See me after class today?" Zainab nodded, unsure why he needed to see her. She wasn't in trouble. Her grades were excellent, and she rarely missed assignments. Shrugging it off, she entered her classroom and joined her best friend, Aisha, who was already flipping through her notes. "What's up?" Aisha asked, glancing at Zainab. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing," Zainab said, brushing off her unease. "Mr. Ahmed just asked to see me later." Aisha wrinkled her nose. "He likes calling students for random things. Probably wants you to help him arrange his notes." Zainab smiled faintly, but her chest tightened. She tried to shake off the growing discomfort as their teacher for the day walked in and began the first lesson. The morning passed quickly, and before long, the bell signaled break time. Students rushed out, some heading to the canteen while others played football on the dusty field. Zainab stayed behind, her heart pounding as she gathered her books. She didn't know why, but the thought of meeting Mr. Ahmed alone filled her with dread. She knocked softly on the staff room door, and his voice came from within. "Come in." The room was quiet, most of the other teachers having stepped out for their break. Mr. Ahmed sat behind his desk, his glasses perched low on his nose. "Ah, Zainab," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of him. "Sit down." She obeyed, clutching her books tightly. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" "Yes," he said, leaning forward. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Zainab. You're one of the brightest students in this school." "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But he continued, "Bright students need guidance. They need someone to help them reach their full potential." Zainab nodded, unsure where the conversation was headed. His gaze lingered on her, making her shift uncomfortably in her seat. "You?" "No," he said, his tone softening. "If you listen to me, I can make sure you become the best student in this school." "Sir?" she asked, confused. "Come closer," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Her stomach churned, but she leaned forward slightly, not wanting to appear rude. In an instant, his hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. Zainab froze, her books falling to the floor with a thud. "Sir, what?" "She," he hissed, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Don't make a sound." Her heart raced as she tried to pull away, but his grip was firm. "Sir, please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Ahmed's face twisted into a sinister smile. "If you tell anyone about this, Zainab, I will kill you. Do you understand?" Zainab's breath hitched, fear paralyzing her. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. Satisfied, he released her wrist, and she stumbled out of the staff room, her hands trembling. Zainab didn't remember much of the rest of the day. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She wanted to tell someone, her parents, her teachers, anyone, but Mr. Ahmed's threat replayed in her mind like a haunting echo. When she got home, her mother noticed her distracted state. "Zainab, are you okay?" Mrs. Musa asked, setting down the pot of soup she had been stirring. "I'm fine, Mama," Zainab lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired from school." Her mother nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Go and rest. Your food is on the table." Zainab went to her room and sat on the bed, her hands shaking as she replayed the encounter in her mind. What had she done wrong? Why had he chosen her? Tears streamed down her face as she realized she couldn't tell anyone. If Mr. Ahmed made good on his threat, her family would be in danger. The next day, Mr. Ahmed called her to his office again. And again. Each time, the abuse escalated, and each time his threats grew darker. "You're mine now," he whispered one day, his voice dripping with malice. "And if you ever try to escape, I'll make sure everyone regrets it." Zainab lived in constant fear, her once bright eyes now dull and lifeless. Her grades began to drop and she avoided her friends, especially Aisha, who frequently asked if something was wrong. "Zainab, talk to me," Aisha said one day after class. "You're not yourself anymore. Did something happen?" Zainab shook her head, avoiding her friend's gaze. "I'm fine." "You're lying," Aisha said firmly. "You've changed. And I don't know why. But if you don't want to talk, that's fine. Just know I'm here for you." Break time became a nightmare. Zainab couldn't escape Mr. Ahmed. He seemed to take pleasure in her silence, using every opportunity to remind her of his control. One day, while sitting in the classroom during break, Zainab's hands trembled as she held her pen. Aisha approached her desk, concerned. "Zainab, you've been so distant lately. If something is wrong, you need to tell me." "I can't," Zainab whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why not?" Aisha pressed. "You're scaring me." Tears filled Zainab's eyes, but she shook her head. "Just leave me alone, Aisha. Please." Aisha frowned but didn't push further. She had no idea how deep Zainab's pain went or the danger she was in. Zainab stared blankly at her mathematics textbook. The classroom was quiet, with most students outside enjoying their break. Mr. Ahmed's voice echoed in her head. "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure you regret it." She glanced at the door, her palms sweating as she waited. She knew he would come. He always did. The sound of heavy footsteps approached the classroom and her heart raced. Mr. Ahmed entered, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto her. "Zainab," he said in his usual calm yet sinister tone. "Come with me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't move. Like clockwork, she followed him out of the classroom, her head down to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. He led her to an empty staff room, his hand firmly on her shoulder. Mr. Ahmed closed the door behind them and turned to face her. "Why do you always look so scared?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I told you, as long as you behave, nothing bad will happen." Zainab said nothing, staring at the floor. "Look at me," he commanded. She lifted her eyes, her body trembling. Mr. Ahmed's face was a mixture of smugness and cruelty. "You're a smart girl, Zainab. You don't want to ruin your life by making bad decisions, do you?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Good," he said, stepping closer. "Now, let's make this quick. You don't want anyone to notice you're missing, do you?" Zainab shut her eyes, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. Back in the classroom, Aisha frowned as she watched Zainab leave with Mr. Ahmed. It wasn't the first time she had noticed this. Samuel had been calling Zainab out of the classroom during break times, always finding some excuse to keep her behind. Zainab had become quieter, her once bright smile now replaced with a distant, haunted look. Aisha turned to her classmate, Kioma. "Have you noticed anything strange about Zainab lately?" she asked. Kioma shrugged. "Not really. She's been acting weird, but who knows? Maybe she's just stressed." Aisha shook her head. "It's not just that. Mr. Ahmed keeps calling her out during break. It's like he's always watching her. Maybe she's his favorite student," Kioma said dismissively. Aisha wasn't convinced. Something wasn't right, and she was determined to find out what it was. After break, Zainab returned to the classroom, her head low. She felt the weight of Mr. Ahmed's threats pressing down on her, suffocating her. She sat at her desk, avoiding Aisha's concerned gaze. "Zainab," Aisha whispered, leaning closer. "Where did you go?" "Nowhere," Zainab muttered. "You're lying," Aisha said. "You've been acting strange for weeks. Did Mr. Ahmed say something to you?" Zainab froze, her heart pounding. "Why would you think that?" Aisha studied her friend's face, noting the fear in her eyes. "Because I see the way he looks at you, and the way you're scared every time he calls your name." Zainab's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "Please, Aisha, just leave it alone." Aisha sighed but didn't press further. "I'm your friend, Zainab. If something's wrong, you can tell me." Zainab didn't respond. The fear of Mr. Ahmed's threats was too strong. At home, Zainab's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Her mother, Mrs. Musa, watched her daughter push her food around her plate at dinner. "Zainab, are you feeling okay?" she asked. "Yes, Mama," Zainab said quietly. "You've been so quiet lately," her father added. "Is something happening at school?" "No, Papa," Zainab replied quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine." Her parents exchanged worried glances, but decided not to push further. They assumed it was typical teenage behavior, not realizing the storm brewing inside her. That night, Zainab lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She felt trapped, unable to escape Mr. Ahmed's control. She wanted to tell her parents, but his threats replayed in her mind. "If you speak, I'll make sure you regret it." Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Ahmed's abuse continued. Zainab's fear grew with each passing day, and she became more withdrawn. Aisha, still suspicious, decided to keep a closer eye on her friend. One day during break, Aisha followed Zainab as she left the classroom, staying out of sight. She trailed her to the staff room and peeked through the window. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Mr. Ahmed standing too close to Zainab, his hand on her shoulder. Aisha's heart pounded. She stepped back, unsure of what to do. Should she confront Mr. Ahmed? Should she report what she saw? Her mind raced as she considered the consequences. She knew that whatever was happening wasn't right, and she couldn't stay silent any longer. After school, Aisha waited for Zainab outside the gate. When Zainab appeared, her head down, Aisha grabbed her arm. "We need to talk," Aisha said. Zainab looked at her friend, panic in her eyes. "Aisha, please." "No," Aisha said firmly. "I saw you with Mr. Ahmed. What's going on?" Zainab froze, her lips trembling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I can't talk about it." "Zainab, he's hurting you, isn't he?" Aisha pressed. "You can't let him get away with this." Tears streamed down Zainab's face as she shook her head. "He said he'll kill me if I tell anyone." Aisha's heart broke at her friend's words. "Zainab, listen to me. You don't have to face this alone. We need to tell someone." "I can't," Zainab sobbed. "He'll hurt my family." Aisha hugged her tightly. "You're my best friend, Zainab. I won't let anything happen to you. But we can't let this continue. You need to trust me." Zainab didn't respond, her sobs muffled against Aisha's shoulder. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, but the fear of Mr. Ahmed's threat still loomed over her. The next day, Aisha decided to act. She went to their form teacher, Mrs. Barko, and told her everything she had seen. "Are you sure about this, Aisha?" Mrs. Barko asked, horrified. "Yes, Ma," Aisha said firmly. "Zainab is too scared to speak up. But I know something is wrong." Mrs. Barko nodded. "Leave it to me. I'll handle this." Mrs. Barko began observing Mr. Ahmed's behavior. She noticed how he always found excuses to call Zainab during break, and how Zainab avoided eye contact with him. Her suspicions grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, Mrs. Barko called Zainab aside. "Zainab, is there something you'd like to tell me?" she asked gently. Zainab shook her head, her eyes downcast. "No, Ma." "Zainab, you can trust me," Mrs. Barko said. "If someone is hurting you, you need to speak up." Zainab hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but Mr. Ahmed's threats echoed in her mind, silencing her once again. "I'm fine, Ma," she whispered, determined. To protect Zainab, Mrs. Barko decided to escalate the matter to the school principal. The wheels were set in motion, and the truth was about to come out, but not without resistance. Mrs. Barko stood outside the principal's office, her heart heavy. She had been observing Mr. Ahmed and Zainab closely for over a week, and her concerns had only deepened. She was certain now that something terrible was happening. As she stepped into the office, she braced herself for the conversation she knew could change everything. "Good morning, Mr. Abubakar," she greeted the principal. The principal, a middle-aged man with a stern face softened only by his wire-framed glasses, looked up. "Good morning, Mrs. Barko. What brings you here?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've noticed some disturbing behavior involving one of our students and a teacher." Mr. Abubakar frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of behavior?" "It's about Mr. Ahmed and Zainab Musa," she began. She recounted what Aisha had told her, the changes she had observed in Zainab, and Mr. Ahmed's suspicious behavior during break times. The principal's expression hardened. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Barko. Are you absolutely sure?" "I wouldn't bring this up if I wasn't," she replied. "I believe we need to investigate further. Zainab might be too scared to speak, but something isn't right." Mr. Abubakar sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We'll call Zainab in for questioning, but we must tread carefully. Accusing a teacher of such a thing without concrete evidence could damage his reputation and the school's name." Later that day, Zainab was summoned to the principal's office. The moment she entered, she felt her knees weaken. The sight of both the principal and Mrs. Barko waiting for her made her stomach churn with dread. Good afternoon, Sir Ma, she greeted softly, clutching the strap of her bag. Zainab, have a seat, the principal said, gesturing to a chair. She sat down, her heart pounding. Did I do something wrong? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Zainab, Mrs. Barko said gently. We just want to talk to you. Zainab glanced between them, her palms sweating. About what? It's about Mr. Ahmed, Mr. Abubakar said, his tone serious. We've noticed he calls you out often during break times. Is there anything you'd like to tell us? Zainab's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting to the floor, and her hands gripped her skirt tightly. No, sir. He just helps me with my work. Zainab, Mrs. Barko said softly, you can trust us. If something is wrong, you need to tell. US, we're here to help. Tears welled in Zainab's eyes, but she shook her head. Nothing is wrong, Ma. He's just teaching me. The principal exchanged a look with Mrs. Barko. Zainab, if you're scared, you don't have to be. No one will hurt you. But if you stay silent, we can't protect you. Zainab opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, Mr. Ahmed's threats replaying in her mind. If you tell anyone, I'll kill you and your family. She stood abruptly, her tears spilling over. Please, I need to go back to class. Before they could stop her, she bolted from the office, her heart pounding. Aisha waited for Zainab after school, determined to confront her again. When Zainab emerged, her face tear-streaked, Aisha ran to her side. What happened? She asked, grabbing Zainab's arm. I can't do this, Zainab sobbed. They're asking questions, but I can't say anything. He'll kill me, Aisha. Aisha's heart broke for her friend. Zainab, you don't have to face this alone. We'll find a way to stop him. How? Zainab cried. He's too powerful. No one will believe me. I believe you, Aisha said firmly. And Mrs. Barko does too. You're not alone, Zainab. We'll figure this out together. Zainab wiped her tears, her chest heaving. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, but the fear still lingered. That evening, Aisha stayed up late thinking. She couldn't let Mr. Ahmed continue to hurt Zainab, but she needed a plan. The next morning, she went to Mrs. Barko with an idea. Ma, I think we need proof, she said. Mrs. Barko frowned. What kind of proof? Maybe we can catch him in the act, Aisha suggested hesitantly. If we can show what he's doing, no one can deny it. That's risky, Mrs. Barko said. But it might be the only way. The two of them devised a plan. Aisha would keep an eye on Zainab during break, and follow her discreetly if Mr. Ahmed called her out again. Meanwhile, Mrs. Barko would be on standby to intervene. The next day, the plan was set in motion. Aisha watched Zainab closely during class, her heart racing. When the bell rang for break, her stomach churned as Mr. Ahmed approached Zainab's desk. Zainab, he said with a smile, I need to see you in the staff room. Zainab hesitated, glancing at Aisha. Aisha gave her a subtle nod, silently encouraging her to stay strong. With a deep breath, Zainab followed Mr. Ahmed out of the classroom. Aisha waited a few moments before slipping out behind them, keeping a safe distance. She followed them to the staff room and crouched outside the window, her phone in hand. Inside, Mr. Ahmed closed the door and turned to Zainab. You know, the rules, he said, his tone dark. No crying, no resistance. Aisha's hands trembled as she recorded the scene. She wanted to burst in and stop him, but she knew she needed to wait for Mrs. Barko. Just as Mr. Ahmed reached for Zainab, the door burst open. Mr. Ahmed. Mrs. Barko's voice rang out, filled with anger. Mr. Ahmed rose, his face a mixture of shock and fear. Zainab stepped back, tears streaming down her face. What is the meaning of this? Mr. Ahmed demanded, trying to regain his composure. I could ask you the same thing, Mrs. Barker shot back. Zainab, step outside. Zainab bolted out of the room, running straight into Aisha's arms. It's over, Aisha whispered, holding her friend tightly. Inside the staff room, Mr. Afid tried to defend himself. This is a misunderstanding. She came to me for help. Save it for the police, Mrs. Barker said coldly. You're finished. The school erupted in chaos as news of Mr. Ahmed's actions spread. Some teachers were horrified, while others struggled to believe it. Parents were called and the police were informed. Mr. Ahmed was arrested that afternoon, still maintaining his innocence. This is a setup, he shouted as he was led away in handcuffs. I've done nothing wrong. Zainab watched from a distance, her emotions a whirlwind of relief and fear. Aisha stood beside her, holding her hand. It's over now, she said softly. But Zainab knew it wasn't truly over. The scars Mr. Ahmed had left on her would take a long time to heal. Still, for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you loved my story. Now subscribe to my channel. Like this video so that YouTube can recommend it to other viewers. What did you learn from this story? Was Zainab too naive for your liking? Comment below.